This is April Federica with season 2 of Brownies for Breakfast. And today I am beyond honored to have Chet Galaska as my guest. Chet Galaska was a company president for most of his career. In retirement, he's working to help diabetics by dispelling the myths and misperceptions that stigmatize diabetics in deter care. He has had diabetes since the year of 1981, so 40 years, and has done so well with it that he was asked to participate in a long-term study for the Joslin Diabetes Center at Harvard University. He has found that people generally do not understand diabetes and that much of what they believe is untrue. To address this, he wrote the diabetes book, What Everyone Should Know, and developed the Challenge Diabetes Program, or the CDP, which teaches the basics to diabetics, those who care about them, and anyone who wants to know the facts. So, Chet, tell myself and our audience about your personal story with diabetes and what challenges you've personally come to face when dealing with this unfortunate epidemic.
Sure, I'd be happy to, April. And thank you very much for having me on as well. I've had type 1 diabetes since 1981. So right now it's been, 42 years since I've had it. So I've learned quite a bit about diabetes during that time. Back in about 10 years ago, I'd like to tell you why I'm doing this in the first place.
Sure.
A number of years ago, I was in Chicago during the week when Ron Santo was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Now, I didn't know that Santo had diabetes, but it turned out he did, and they wrote quite a bit about it in the local papers at that time. Now, I need to tell you the story that prompted me to get involved in educating people about diabetes. But those of you who don't take insulin need to know the background here. Santo was type 1, and he took insulin. Everybody knows that the high blood sugar is what causes the long-term damage, but low blood sugars are also a problem, but it's a different kind of problem. When you take insulin, there's a good chance that your sugar will go too low. Now, that's a problem because your brain takes sugar directly out of the bloodstream. It doesn't store it like other cells in the body do. So when the sugar level is too low in the bloodstream, the brain starts to get funky. Things that the brain controls like balance, sweating, eyesight, everything starts to go haywire a little bit at a time. Now, people who take insulin, and that does include some type 2s, obviously, understand the symptoms of this, and we can correct it fairly easily because all you need to do is eat some sugar and boost that blood level, glucose blood level back up. So here's the story. It's a game in Chicago. It's the last of the ninth inning. The Cubs are down by 2. There are 2 outs and 2 men on base. So Santo was in the on-deck circle, and he felt the low blood sugar coming on. He started to sweat a little more. His eyes were getting a little funky. So he knew what was going on. His problem was that nobody on the Cubs knew that he had diabetes. He was afraid the Cubs would fire him if they found out. Now, this is back in the early 1960s, and he was probably right about that. They probably would have fired him if they knew he was a diabetic. So nobody knows that he's got the condition. So there he is in the on-deck circle, and he's praying that the guy at the plate will make it out to retire the side. Well, the guy walked. So Santos said he walked up to the plate, and he looked up to see 3 scoreboards, 3 pitchers, and 30 some odd people standing out in the field because he was seeing triple. He said when the pitcher threw the ball, it looked like it had a slinky attached to it. So he took a wild swing at it, connected, and put it out of the park for a walk-off grand slam home run. So he made it around the bases and back to the dugout where he ate his Snickers bar, which was his favorite candy. So he ate the bar in time to recover, and nobody ever knew that story until Ron Santo Day 10 years later when he retired. So I read that and I thought, man, what an amazing story. But nobody knew for 10 years that the real story was that he made it back to the dugout without passing out, because that could very well have happened. When your eyesight gets that bad, you have a really low blood sugar. So that was really a cool story. I came home and started telling people that story, and I came to realize that nobody understands diabetes well enough to get it. So I found myself explaining the basics of diabetes to a lot of people. And that was fine as far as type 1 went, because I knew type 1. But with type 2 was a different story. What I realized is that I didn't know much about type 2, and much of what I thought about it was untrue. In fact, I used to, in my own head, I used to think, well, I've got the real diabetes. I've got the one where it's an, excuse me, autoimmune disease where my islet cells have been killed off. I mean, that's a serious problem. And I always felt that type 2s just had to lose a little weight and you would be okay. Well, that turns out not to be true at all. And a lot of other things that I learned were also not true. Once I realized this, I understood how unfair the world is to diabetics, especially to type 2s, because people do believe that you could cure it, or you could reverse it, or you could prevent it. And none of those are actually true. You know, you can get your blood sugar under control underneath the diabetic threshold, but insulin resistance is not going to go away, no matter what you do. So we are all in a struggle day to day. No matter what we do, we can be good at it, we can be worse at it, but it's always going to be there no matter what you do. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to educate everybody about diabetes. And that's why the title of my book is The Diabetes Book, What Everyone Should Know, because these are things everyone should know so that diabetics can have pride in doing a very hard thing rather than feeling guilty and ashamed by it. In fact, I've had people, I was doing the CDP before COVID. Unfortunately, that killed everything because, nobody was meeting to do anything for 2 or 3 years. But when I was doing the classes, very often people would come to me afterwards and tell me that the best thing I told them was that they weren't at fault for getting it. They've been walking around feeling guilty about it, and there's no reason to feel that way, except that society doesn't understand the disease, and that's what most people think. So that's really the issue I'm trying to address.
Yeah, and that's an amazing mission right there. And may I add, for those of you who don't know, in recognition of Chet's work, he was presented the Heroes Walking Among Us award by the Massachusetts Foot and Ankle Society. And according to you, Chet, these are doctors who know firsthand how damaging, the ignorance about diabetes is.
Yep.
And I know from a tremendous amount of my personal research about diabetes, because when I was diagnosed, I basically had to educate myself.
Mm-hmm.
And there is unfortunately such a stigma about learning about diabetes in medical schools, and in my experience, even in primary and secondary schools, because there's a negative connotation surrounding, socioeconomic status and other factors.
Yep. It's really a damaging thing. A researcher once said that diabetes is one of the few diseases in America today
Mm-hmm.
where it's okay to blame the victim. And that's what happens. We get blamed because of the way the disease is presented. As I mentioned earlier, you can find people who tell you it's curable. Well, if it's
Mm-hmm.
curable, then why don't you cure it? It's just saying you're responsible because this is out there. And that's what's got to be corrected.
Yeah.
And it's a lot more dangerous than just the way people feel ashamed or guilty about having diabetes. It's got real world effects. When I first got it, I decided to keep it secret. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
diabetics do that because we don't want to put up with the stigma that comes along with diabetes.
Right.
So, I kept it a secret for 30 years until I decided to write the book. This was
Mm-hmm.
after the Santos story and all that. And I figured, well, this is a crazy situation that's got to be fixed.
Yeah.
So I wrote the book, um, and I told everybody that I knew that I had diabetes. And if they had it or they knew somebody who did, let them know because I'd like to talk to them. I spent a lot of time talking to other diabetics. So one guy who I'd known for 20 years, who didn't know that I had diabetes, came up to me and he said, "So I hear you've got diabetes." And I said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "That's funny. You don't look like a diabetic." Well, there you go. I don't know what he expected a diabetic to look like, but it,
Exactly.
but it wasn't somebody who was a capable, healthy person. And that's what you're fighting against. The minute people think you're diabetic, it's like, well, there's something wrong with you. You're weaker or you're not reliable or whatever they have in their heads. And that just reinforced my mission. But there's one other aspect that's related to this that I think is really serious. I ran into a former employee a few years ago, and he had become diabetic.
Hmm.
He ignored it totally. He had type 2, ignored it totally. After a number of years, he couldn't stand the pain anymore. So he went to the hospital. They
Hmm.
amputated one leg on one day and they took the other one on the following day.
Oh my gosh.
And he told me that if I ever get diabetes, to make sure I take care of it.
Hmm.
Now, this guy worked for me when I had diabetes.
Right.
He was a long term employee, so he worked for me for a long time.
Hmm.
Now, I kind of wonder if he knew that I had diabetes, whether he might have come to me and asked me about it. And I could have told him how serious this thing is and how you have to deal with it every day and the basic things you need to do to deal with it. If that conversation had happened, maybe he would have taken it seriously and maybe he would still be alive today. But it
Yeah.
didn't happen because I kept it quiet.
Hmm.
And it's a real problem. If you don't get, nobody should get the impression I'm equating diabetes with cancer. But here's a big difference. Cancer survivors take pride in the very difficult thing they've done and continue to do. And everybody in society respects them for taking on that fight.
Hmm.
That's the way it ought to be for diabetes too. It ought to be, if you've
Absolutely.
got diabetes, you need to take care of it. And if people understood what it was all about, they'd be able to encourage diabetics and probably get a lot more diabetics to really work on it. That to
Yeah.
me, we talk about the diabetes epidemic and how people don't take care of it. They're non-compliant, which is not my favorite term. That itself is
Hmm.
kind of pejorative, but they're not compliant. Non-compliance is a real problem. Um, but a real problem here is the fact that terms like non-compliant turn people off from wanting to put themselves into that situation.
Yeah.
And the people like my former employee, people who just plain don't treat it, they're the ones who are really taking the brunt of this
Hmm.
because they're literally dying from it. I mean, it's a fatal disease.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I almost died from diabetic ketoacidosis without an
It,
inch of knowing that I was in fact diabetic.
wow.
Yeah,
Wow. Could I ask you a question?
sure.
What was that like having ketoacidosis?
You know, it's kind of to make a long story short, I was feeling throat pain, first of all,
Mm-hmm.
because of like the acid reflux buildup. And and of course it didn't help. It was the start of a new job for me. So I had to leave early because otherwise I would have been, in hindsight, I would have had to been taken away in an ambulance
Mm-hmm.
because I was feeling so miserable. And when I got home, it was even worse. I started puking up black bile. And
Wow.
yeah, it was really bad. And not to be gross or anything, but like I was obviously constipated and I didn't even put that together because, in primary and secondary schools, they don't teach you this stuff
Mm-hmm.
until finally when I got to the hospital after succumbing to my mom's decision to go to the emergency room, which I'm so thankful I did because otherwise I would have died.
You certainly would have.
Yeah. I mean, it's deadly. It's not a joke. And when I woke up finally after my pancreas almost shut down, um, the doctor said, like, April, you do know you're diabetic, right? And I'm like, I do now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, not to make light of it, but it is like in hindsight, it's ridiculous because again, they don't teach you about this stuff. And
No,
there's
and I don't get why. You know, one of the things that I've found also is that many medical people don't really get it either.
exactly.
You know, the endocrinologists and the CDEs, they
Hmm.
get it. Those
Yeah.
people absolutely are supportive, and they're wonderful. But if you get, you know, your typical PA or even a general practitioner, you know, they're not specialists in diabetes,
Yeah.
and they often really don't understand. I used to give talks to Rotary clubs and churches
Hmm.
and things like that.
Hmm.
There was a Rotary Club meeting I spoke at, and there was a doctor in the crowd. And after I talked about diabetes having a genetic basis,
Hmm.
people turned to the doctor and said, "Well, is that true?" And she said, "Yeah, I guess. Seems like most everything is genetic." You know, so I mean, he didn't know. I mean, he was a doctor, and he really didn't know.
Exactly.
So I mean, it's not his specialty, obviously, but you get a lot of probably even most medical people who really they just don't know. So
Exactly. Yeah. And what the weird thing is at the hospital, they didn't even know what type I was
mhm.
until I finally got to my endocrinologist, got to see my endocrinologist, the top endocrinologist in the country. And he said, and so did my diabetes educator, um, that you're definitely type 2, especially after my blood results came in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's amazing how um this is probably not the right word, but how elusive diabetes can be. However, it's ironic because it's it's like the ongoing epidemic of centuries.
Yeah, I know it's a huge problem. I mean, diabetes is the seventh biggest cause of death in the country,
Exactly.
and even that probably understates it because you know historically there's been a problem with people dying, and diabetes is not put down as a cause of death.
Mm-hmm.
So you know you've got a whole bunch of people out there who have died of heart failure or kidney
Yeah.
failure or whatever, and diabetes is not mentioned as the underlying cause when in fact it is.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a do you remember Lee Iacocca? You may not be old enough to, but he was the father of the Ford Mustang back in the
Oh,
60s, and he later became the president of Chrysler Corporation, managed to pull out of bankruptcy. He was really an American hero.
oh, I see.
Well, his wife Mary had diabetes, and she had cardiovascular disease because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And when I mean, she knew she was going to die. It was just a matter of time, and it wasn't that far away.
Yeah.
And she made him promise that when she died, that he put made sure that diabetes was put down as the cause of death, because she knew that if this got corrected, they would probably pay more attention to diabetes than many people do.
Yeah.
So yeah, and Iacocca later on, he created a foundation. It's named after his wife to support people who have diabetes. So she was kind of a pioneer in that she recognized that just the paperwork was a big problem.
Yeah.
But I think that's becoming better now. But
I
it's
agree.
it's taken a while for it to happen.
Yeah, it's definitely taken a while. And and I hate to sound like a broken record, but like I know there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there, and we need to have a different approach on if we're gonna fix, the stigma on diabetes. And my question for you, Chet, is what can we do as a society and how can we do it?
Well, I think that, you know, I hate to sound like I'm pushing my book, but I wrote the book to educate everyday people about this. And the first thing I would do is have a look at the book. You can get it on, it's on Amazon, you can get it online.
Yeah.
It's cheap. It's cheap. And there's a lot of information in there. I've had medical people read the book
Hmm.
and they've told me how much they learned. As a matter of fact, my own doctor told me that, my general practitioner. Um, and I just recently had a nurse tell me that she, you know, but there's a lot of stuff in there. It's not just your basic clinical, you got to control your blood sugar, this is a pill I'm going to give you, and on and on and on.
Hmm.
It's really even more basic stuff than that. One of the things that I really emphasize is exercise.
Yeah.
I made it a habit of going to diabetes programs just to see what they were like.
Hmm.
And I'll never forget, there was one that was sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. And it was, the curriculum was all set up and the CDEs went through the program. But what they did, April, is they explained what diabetes was. And then they talked about food. And then they talked about medication. And the
Right.
only time exercise was brought up was when I brought it up. Now, this is a critical thing. If you just go for a walk 20 minutes a day, it'll have an impact on your blood sugar. Even
Hmm.
if you go for the walk every other day, it'll have an impact on your blood sugar. In fact, with the book, this is a funny story. Uh, the person who did the design work on the book, uh, she told me she didn't read the book. She just did the design work. She became a type 2 diabetic.
Oh.
So she decided to read the book. And she did. This was after she had been prescribed a medication by her doctor. She went to pick it up and they were going to charge her $500. And she said, no, I don't think I'm going to pay that much money. Then she went back and read the book. 3 months later, she went to her doctor and she had lost weight and her blood sugars were under 7.
Hmm.
And he asked her how she did that. And she said, well, I read Galaska's book, as if the doctor knew who I was. But she said she simply went for a walk for 20 minutes a day and she watched her carbohydrates. And for her, anyway, she was early enough on in type 2 that her pancreas had enough ability to control her blood sugar.
Hmm.
So she was able to do that. Early on with type 2, really, that's what you can do, because your pancreas hasn't lost that much of its capacity yet. And just by helping it with the exercise, you can keep your blood sugars pretty low. And that's the kind of thing that we need to get out there. But to get it out more widely, well, get the whole idea of what diabetes is and why things have to change. I think diabetics themselves have to be fluent enough about their disease to talk to other people about it, and then come out of your shells and talk about it and
Hmm.
explain to people this is what's happening.
Yeah.
I had, I'll give you an example. I was at a dinner one time and I was sitting next to a guy who knew that I was diabetic.
Hmm.
And so, it was a Polish restaurant. So they had the typical Polish food. They had kielbasa, which is sausage, pierogies, which are basically dough turnovers,
Hmm.
golubkis, which are stuffed cabbage, and things like that. So this guy turns to me and asks me if I'm going to eat all that. And I told him, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm only going to eat one slice of bread, even though I've got two of them there. I like pierogies, so I'm going to eat those. The stuffed cabbage, it's got rice and it's got pork. The rice is going to raise my blood sugar. The pork is not. So I'm going to have some of that. The kielbasa and the other meats they had there, I'm going to load up on those, because those won't raise my blood sugar.
Right.
So I went through the entire plate and I said, this is what diabetics need to do. We need to look at our plates and ask, where are the carbs? And then, decide what you're going to eat and how much of anything you're going to eat. Because people have the idea that you can't eat sugar ever. You shouldn't be eating any carbohydrates, but it's really a balancing game. We have to know how to play that game.
Yeah.
And if we do, you can really help yourself. But it's that kind of thing that just in casual conversations with non-diabetics, if we can explain to people, number one, it starts with genetics, and number two, this is how I have to deal with it. You get some respect there because they understand how much thought goes into this day
Right.
after day after day. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know about you, but I'm thinking about my blood sugar all of the time.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
me too.
yeah, I mean, it's the number one thing you think about. So really, if we're trying hard to control it, we deserve respect for learning enough to be able to do it, and then having the fortitude to go ahead and pull it off.
Yeah,
Nobody's perfect all the time, and I fall off the wagon just like everybody else. And a
exactly.
lot of times there are things that happen that I still don't even understand. Uh, the the liver, well, the liver, you probably know it. It really, I call it the wild card because it does crazy things. It'll dump glucose into your bloodstream, and you have no idea that it's happening.
Right.
That kind of thing happens, and for the longest time. Well, here's an example for you. I've worked out my whole life. Um, and that's one of the reasons my diabetes has been in good control. By the
Hmm.
way, my A1Cs run 6.6 or 6.7. So,
That's great.
the control. I mean, I'm doing a good job with the control. I'm actually very proud of that, and I look forward to going to see my CDE because I know I'm going to get a pat on the head. So that's a nice thing. But when I was a little younger, I was working out really hard. And what I would find is that sometimes my blood sugar would be higher after the exercise than it was when I started. And I couldn't figure out why, because really exercise should reduce it because active muscle pulls glucose right out of the bloodstream and it burns it or it stores it. So it's a thing that happens right away. But it wasn't happening for me. It was actually higher. And then it dawned on me that the problem was that I was burning off so much glucose that my liver decided that I needed more of it. And it would dump
Right.
that glucose into my bloodstream with the result that when I'm done, the blood sugar level is higher.
Hmm.
So, that kind of crazy thing happens with diabetes too, where it's beyond your control. If you get really stressed, it'll raise your blood sugar because
Yeah.
it's a fight or flight thing. And the liver says, well, you need some glucose in case you have to run real fast. So it's complicated. But the more we explain these kinds of things to people, number one, they get educated. But you know what else, April? They're fascinated by it. Once they start learning about it, they really find that it's interesting
Yeah.
because it is interesting. Um, so I think that's the biggest thing. If diabetics could just learn about it and learn to communicate about it, it would help. And also do it in a way that you've got kind of a chip on your shoulder where this is what I'm dealing with. And, you don't understand it. So I'd like to explain it to you.
Yeah.
And people will listen.
Definitely. Yeah. And this is what I try to educate the public on every day. And, it's like I have this chip on my shoulder, like you said, and this is how I'm going to deal with it. I'm going to educate people on it.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that's why I'm on podcasts. I didn't even really know what a podcast was until a year or two ago, and at first I thought, well, it's probably just a bunch of people talking about whatever. And then it turned out there was a whole universe of people like you who are out there who are
Hmm.
serious people talking about serious topics.
Yep.
And I found, I'm just getting started. I've only done like 6 of them so far,
Right.
but I've got another 4 that are booked. So I'm getting out there talking to people like you and hopefully reaching a lot more people than I ever could teaching the course, 10 or 20 people at a time.
Definitely. Yeah, and it's because of my diabetes diagnosis that I've really gotten into, gut health and its correlation to diabetes, as
Hmm.
well as hormone health.
Yep.
And I thusly became a nutritionist and I thusly became a gut health consultant and now a hormone and type 2 diabetes expert.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah,
That's pretty impressive.
thank you. Yeah, and what you've done is so impressive. And if you don't mind me asking, how can my viewers find you? Do you have social media at all or no?
I don't do social media,
Oh,
but
I
I
see.
do have a website
Oh, okay.
and they could go there and there's a way to contact me there.
Mm-hmm.
They could, yeah, just respond to the website. The website is challengediabetes.us. And
Gotcha.
people always throw the .com in there, but it's .us.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that is how you can find it in the show notes, everybody. And this has been Brownies for Breakfast. Thank you so much, Chet.
You're welcome, Don. And in fact, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Anytime.